Okay, welcome everybody to this Zoom lecture hosted by the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society. If you don't know me already, I'm Mark Pennington and I'm the director of the Centre. We've been away for a while with many events postponed due to the ongoing pandemic, but I'm very pleased for us to be back in this Zoom format. One advantage of which is that we're able to welcome an audience from outside the UK for the first time to these events. I would ask you, if you don't mind, to bear with us because this is the first time we've done a Zoom event at the Centre, so we may be a little bit clunky with the technology, but we'll do our best. So we're delighted to have with us today Professor Ian Shapiro. Ian is Professor of Political Science at Yale University. He's written very widely on democratic theory and practice, including The Real World of Democratic Theory, Politics Against Domination, and Responsible Parties. He's also the co-author with Donald Green of one of my personal favorites, Pathologies of Rational Choice Theory. Today, he's going to speak to us on political parties. So I'd like to welcome Professor Ian Shapiro.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me, and thank you for coming at 6 o'clock. I don't know if it's here we have a wet, wintry evening. It's very London weather, but I hope you guys have something better. So I'm going to talk about political parties today, and I'm going to, now my slides have stopped working. Sorry. These are the central questions that concern me. In much of my book with Francis Rosenbluth and various papers I've been working on with the one I circulated, but also with others. I'm interested in the differences between two-party systems and multi-party systems, and in the differences between weak parties and strong parties. And what the implications are for what actually happens in politics. Those are sort of the central questions that concern me. So for people who like 2x2s, if you want to sort of the stereotypical large, strong parties would be, the example would be the UK, at least until the last couple of decades when they started weakening the British parties. Congenitally weak party system in the US, designed to be weak and made even weaker over the last several decades. And I'll spell out what I mean by strong and weak. And then multiple party systems, typically the West European systems, typically they were historically strong parties, although some have also weakened. And then multiple weak parties with the kind of things you find with open list PR or you have multiple stages, as in France, which keeps small parties alive, or the Latin American story. So my work on my own and with others is trying to understand the implications of these differences, and I'm going to share some of that with you today. But I do want to say that none of this happens in a vacuum. And so I'm going to start out by talking about some big changes in the economic and demographic landscape that I think have structured a lot of what's been going on in these different political systems. I'm going to point to 4 big changes in particular. And then I'm going to talk about the implications of those changes for multi-party systems, where the big story is fragmentation of parties in the legislature, and in two-party systems where the big story has become weaker parties. And these are both responses to the inability of governments to serve their traditional constituencies. But I think it's important to think about them together, because we all have an impulse to think that the grass is greener on the other side, So many people in the US think the problem to American dysfunction would be to go to some form of PR. And many people in European systems also reach for examples from systems they don't have, like moving from closed to open list, or something like that. So rather than thinking the grass is always greener somewhere else, I think it's important to have a kind of synoptic view of what's going on and why there's been so much alienation from establishment parties in all these systems, which has bred the rise of populism, particularly since 2016. And then I'll talk in light of what I've said about some purported remedies, what might be more likely to work and what is snake oil at best or bloodletting at worst. So I'll just jump in. My plan is to talk for about 40 minutes, maybe a little less, but certainly not more. And I'll discipline myself to that constraint. So politics doesn't happen in a vacuum, and there have been some huge structural changes in the economic and demographic landscape that I think are informing and structuring much of what goes on in politics. And so I just want to single out four. And the first is it's common knowledge, but this is one of Piketty and Saez's pictures, where you basically see we've had massive increases in inequality in many of the established democracies. The US is the top line here, and we've gone from the Gilded Age at the beginning of this century back to levels of inequality that haven't been seen since. And this U shape is the standard sort of Piketty and Saez. They've been studying this for decades in many countries. And as you can see, not everybody has gone through the same extremes. But the basic story is this U-shaped curve where inequality came down in the first part of the century. It flattened out in the middle part of the century. But in almost every country, we could have put more countries up, and you'd have gotten this story. It's since the 1970s inequality. This is top decile income, but if you look at various ways of measuring inequality, you essentially get the same story. It's often been noted. So here, if you look at the US and the UK, the U is more pronounced than in Germany and France. And it's often been thought, and particularly this is one of the reasons why people on the left have generally preferred PR to single-member district systems that produce two parties, is that it seems like the PR systems have generally been less inegalitarian. That's been true historically, but we think there are reasons for questioning whether it's still true, and you'll see why we think that as this goes on. So that's the first big fact. The second is the declining political power and economic power of organized labor. Basically, I'll give you the American picture since it's so extreme. It's basically the peak of union membership was in the 1950s, and it's been coming down. And so, now it's, this doesn't get all the way to the present, but if you look beyond here, the story is not changed. And if you look just at private sector, it would be even more extreme. This is the basic story here is the disappearance of industrial jobs, the rise of the service economy, which is much harder to unionize, the departure of jobs offshore, and increasingly to technology. Here you can see this is a story that in less extreme forms has happened in many countries. not since the 1950s, but certainly since the 1970s. We've seen this declining power of organized labor. There are a few exceptions. Spain, for example, it's basically flat. You've had countries like Iceland, it's basically flat. But by far the predominant story in all of these countries is that as they've shifted to service economies and and trade barriers have come down, jobs have gone offshore, and increasingly with jobs going to technology, organized labor is a less consequential player, both on the shop floor and in the political system. Many people think that you can see relationships between the growing inequality and the declining power of organized labor. That's again a picture from the US. Just another picture, kind of, dozens and dozens and dozens you could put up. But middle class incomes have stagnated and fallen, just as union membership has declined. So that's a second big fact. The third one, which is related to, but importantly different from inequality, is long-term job insecurity. So it used to be the case that people finished their education either after high school or university, and then entered the job force and worked in one job for 30 years and then retired. And they worked their way up, they got promotions. There was basically, that was the story. That is no longer true. This is a panel study of the number of times baby boomers in the US, late baby boomers, people born between 57 and 64, have changed jobs. And so the story it tells is that people who are entering the workforce at the beginning of their lives today should expect to change jobs at least a dozen, if not more, times during their working lives. Maybe up until the age of 20, early 20s, that might be reflecting summer jobs or while people are in college or something like that. But it goes on, as you can see, throughout their lives. And this is a very, very different world because it creates long-term job insecurity. It means that, it's fine for people on the right end of the tech revolution who may be in the information revolution, who are, maybe they finish college, they kind of work for McKinsey or something and run some startups, then go to business school and come out. So those people might be building up assets while they're hopping from job to job. But for the vast majority of workers, what we're looking at is people essentially downwardly mobile, jumping from jobs that have better benefits to jobs that have worse or no benefits, jobs that come with some job security to less and less to no job security, people being fired as employees and rehired as independent contractors with less pay and fewer rights and protections. And so you've seen this massive growth of job insecurity that is a long-term structural thing. This is not episodic or business cycle related unemployment, but largely it was initially trade driven, but increasingly it's technology driven. So the McDonald's that used to have 20 people working in it and now has 6 people working in it will 5 years from now probably have 1 person watching robots making hamburgers. And this is true up and down the occupational scale. More and more middle class are being hollowed out, jobs going to technology, rather than say a bank manager who was a middle class occupation, deciding whether or not somebody should get a mortgage. Now you'll apply to Quicken loans and it'll all be done over the phone, typed in by somebody with a high school education. So long-term job insecurity. And then just finally, one more before we jump into the parties, is the demographic crunch. What we generally think of as the social democracies in Western Europe and the New Deal Great Society in the US, all existed in a particularly propitious time. There was a lot of favorable demographic and geopolitical factors that helped those systems thrive. But if you look at what's happened, this is a picture of the demographic transition where, which is sort of 4 phases. You went from a world of high birth rates and high death rates, and then big explosions of population as the death rates came down, and then the birth rates came down. But now all of these countries are in late stage 4 or stage 5 of the demographic transition, where the new equilibrium is low birth rate, low death rate. And the implication of that for welfare states is increasing dependent ratios. That is, the dependency ratio measures the proportion of the population that's not working, which is generally taken to be under 15 and over 65, to the proportion of the population working. But what really matters is the over 65s, because that's what puts all the fiscal pressure on governments. The under 15-year-olds are generally, the parents internalize those costs. But it's these aging populations, particularly extreme in countries like Japan and Italy, but going on everywhere, where you have shrinking working age populations, supporting expanding retired populations who live longer and therefore cost more to maintain, and it creates the potential for intergenerational distributive conflict in all of these systems, and makes it more and more difficult for what we thought of as the social democratic welfare states of the 1970s and 80s and 90s to be financed and run in the ways that they are. So that's the economic and demographic landscape that we're talking about. And what I want to do now is spend some time talking about what this means in multi-party systems and what this means in two-party systems. And I want to start with multi-party systems. And so the big story here, there are nuances which I'll get into, but the big story here has been the fragmentation of parties in the legislature. This is a data set I, with some colleagues, have been building of 26 OECD countries since 1960s. And it's here we're looking at the number of parties in the legislature, or the number of effective parties, where you discount the parties by their size, but they tell the same story. We've basically seen an increase in fragmentation of parties in the legislature. So we've seen more parties in the legislature. And if you start to dig into what's going on there, what is notable is that the fragmentation of left parties is particularly pronounced, having gone from around 3 to over 6 or of effective parties, as you can see, from maybe 2, from below 1.5 to above 2. And what's noticeable here on this figure is, even though the number of combined left parties has gone up, the number of votes the left is getting has not. So that's why we get fragmentation, because you have essentially more votes the same number of votes going to a greater number of parties. This is something we're studying now, but you know, our hypothesis is that that it has a lot to do with the decline of industrial jobs. Because if you think about it this way, traditional left of center parties like the Social Democrats in Germany, what they're doing is that they are protecting, if you like, a shrinking labor aristocracy. As the number of union jobs gets smaller and smaller, they are in the sort of corporatist deals that they're making with big business. They are defending a smaller and smaller number of workers, and they're defending them less well because they have less leverage. And so it's not surprising that these parties, these left of center parties, the traditional left of center parties, have been hemorrhaging votes, say in Germany to Die Linke, to the Greens, and of course over to the far right, to the Alternative for Deutschland, and also to the CDU. As these people are no longer protected by social democratic parties, it's not surprising that they become available to be mobilized by others. And so that's the story on the left. If you look at fragmentation on the right, it also is occurring, but it's less systematic. And certainly since 1990, you could probably draw, you know, pretty much of a straight line through that. So there is fragmentation, but it hasn't increased in the same way. And so this is why we start, you know, traditionally in multi-party systems, we didn't see very weird governments forming that would be very difficult to be accountable. So in 2015 in Greece, for example, you know, that was the election outcome and that was the government that formed, far left party and a far right party, you know, or 3 years later in Italy, that was the election result and that was the government that formed. Again, you know, anti-system parties from the left and the right forming governments and, you know, able to agree on very little except for their hostility to the EU. Now, people used to say, well, the big exception here was Germany. They had, you know, Labradoodle and poodle doors we have talked about. So a Labradoodle is a dog that doesn't shed but has a nice personality. And the thought was the Germans had come up with the Labradoodle, the perfect mixed system. You know, they got the benefits of PR, but basically for a variety of reasons, strong parliamentarism. They didn't want to go back to what they had done in Weimar with strong executive. They have a mixed system where they also have, in addition to the PR bit, they have 299 large single-member districts to limit the size of the number of parties, and they also have a 5% threshold to force the smaller parties to amalgamate. They have very disciplined candidate and leader selection, at least until recently. They had things like budget rules and external constraints from the EU that limited the centrifugal tendencies in PR systems. And it was all underpinned by the post-war corporatist deal between business and labor that I indicated is now fraying. And so even in Germany in 2017, you got this outcome where, you know, that for the first time, the Alternative for Deutschland passed the threshold and actually became the third biggest party in the Bundestag. The SPD had been so traumatized by their participation in previous grand coalitions that they said they weren't going to participate again. And Merkel spent 6 months trying to put together a coalition between the Free Democrats and the Greens, but failed, unsurprisingly, because the Free Democrats are like US libertarians. They don't want any regulation, and the Greens want green regulation. So, and over the course of those 6 months, while she was trying to do that, all the opinion polls showed that if another election was held, the AfD would do even better. And so finally, the SPD was cajoled into coming back into a grand coalition, kicking and screaming all the way. And so even there, you've seen the same sort of outcome as we've grown accustomed to seeing in Europe. The negotiations with the SPD were very hard because they've actually decentralized control of the party, so that not only the Congress, but the 450,000 members had to vote on every feature of the coalition deal. Merkel had to give them 6 ministries, including the finance ministries. And since she also has to give 3 to the CSU, she was trying to run a government with the control of 5 ministries. And it didn't help. So if you see what happened the following year in the regional elections in Bavaria and Hesse, the CDU hemorrhaged more support to the Alternative for Deutschland and the SPD to the Greens. Similar story in the local elections last year, AfD making more and more gains. Merkel was, because of the desperate fortunes of the CDU, was forced to announce she'll leave by the end of 2021. So this is you can just this is from the Financial Times a couple of years ago. If you could look at the 2013 and 2017 elections, you can see the SPD losing votes all over the place so they have a shrunken presence, including to the CDU, and then the CDU hemorrhaging to the Alternative for Deutschland. And so this is the kind of story that we see. And it's a similar story elsewhere. You can look, whether it's Austria or Holland or Israel or many of these other social democratic systems. The left of center party that used to come in first or second is coming increasingly in fourth or fifth. And the less seldom present in governments. And even when they are present, I forgot to put this slide in, but we have found that when left of center parties are in the government, unemployment actually increases. The supposition being, though we haven't had a rigorous look at that yet, the supposition being that they are, again, I say this is sort of labor aristocracy story. Their incentive is to defend the employed workers in unionized jobs, which are the core of their coalition, but at the expense of long-term unemployed workers who then become available for mobilization by more extreme parties. So the upshot is that fragmented parties have a diminished capacity to form governments and to govern, increasing voter alienation and making voters more available for populist mobilization. And as a way of transitioning now to starting to talk about two-party systems, we might just want to reflect for a second that on the 1930s, and whether, one question is, are we facing back to the future? In the 30s, the British had the Mosleyites, but they in fact in 1936 the Mosleyites had more support by some measures in Britain than the Nazi Party had in Germany, but they never got any seats in Parliament. Likewise with Lindbergh and others in the U.S. The U.S. was in the 1930s able to enact the New Deal, whereas in the European systems it was again a period of economic devastation, party fragmentation, and we all know how it ended. So let's talk about two-party systems. And so here I want to make a distinction between strong and weak parties. And the story about, what is a strong party? How do you know it when you see it? There's one recent definition there. Unified, centralized, stable, organizationally complex, and tied to long-standing constituencies. I like simple definitions, so I say a strong party is a party when everyone is on one team. Everybody's trying to get to the same outcome. It's a situation where backbenchers choose front benches, who choose backbenchers, who choose front benches. The backbenchers are happy to delegate to the front benches and allow themselves to be whipped. So they give them the right to discipline them. But it's Ulysses and the Sirens' discipline in that they may know that they're going to be particular interests in their constituencies that pull them in a certain way. But overall, it's important to be the winning party. So you give power to the leadership on the understanding that they will discipline you only to the extent that it's necessary to actually put together a platform that can win nationally. So they want you to be able to survive in your constituency, but they also need to be able to win overall. So the leaders have enough rope to hang themselves. If they don't deliver victories, they won't last very long. You could never get a situation, say, as in the US, where Nancy Pelosi led the Democrats to 4 successive defeats after 2010 and still managed to survive as Speaker. So they have enough rope to hang themselves. Weak parties are the converse of that. Campaigning is all retail campaigning. Candidates and platforms are controlled from below or outside. And leaders in the legislature have a great deal of trouble setting any kind of legislative agenda because they can't whip the backbench to support it. So that's the distinction that I'm talking about between weak and strong parties. The big story here in recent times has been to weaken parties. And I think it's related to the big story I talked about in multi-party systems, in that when the economy stops performing for people, they tend to turn on the political system and say there must be something wrong with our political system and we need to fix it because our jobs are getting worse, our wages are declining, we are facing long-term employment insecurity, the rich are getting richer. There's something wrong with the political system that needs to be fixed. And the impulse is to try and get more and more control of the system. And so symptoms of this, we've seen across the democratic world, increasing reliance on ballot initiatives, referendums, and plebiscites. Just think of the Brexit story. The UK had never even had a referendum until 1975. That was also a Europe referendum. And the increasing reliance on them unbundles issues and allows people, unbundles the bundles that parties put together and allows people to, with intense preferences, to vote on the intense preferences that they have. We can talk more about that, perhaps in relation to Brexit. I have a long discussion of that in the paper, perhaps in relation to other things. after the end of my initial remarks, if people are interested. Direct selection of party leaders. Again, you in the UK have had you've had great experience of that with this story of Jeremy Corbyn, where he was directly elected by the membership, the Parliamentary Labour Party, the membership being well to the left, not only of the Parliamentary Labour Party, but the median voter. Not surprisingly, the Parliamentary Party found that they couldn't support Corbyn's agenda and be viable in their constituencies. So they voted by, I think it was 162 to 40, no confidence in him. And 3 months later, the members re-elected him by 62%. Obviously, that's going to create an unviable situation in Parliament. And we saw how that played out earlier this year, or last year, I should say, not surprisingly. So it's a great weakening of the Labour Party that went on. We have seen in many multi-party systems moves to strengthen presidents, which is another way of weakening parties, moving to open list PR, which encourages personalist politics. And what I want to spend a little bit of time on, just because it's so central to the US story, but primaries and caucuses have become important elsewhere as well, increasing reliance on primaries and caucuses. So if you think about a two-party system, the median voter being somewhere there, and we're thinking about one dimension for the moment. If in a primary, you've got to win, the right of center party's got to win there first, the left of center party's got to win there first, and so that pulls the parties apart. But it's not just that, because in fact, you have very low turnout in primaries, and it tends to be voters on the extremes of the parties. So it's really these people who pick the candidate for the left of center party, and these people who pick the candidate for the right of center party. So this is the story of the rise of the Tea Party in the US. Very low turnout primaries produce candidates who are well to the right of the median voter in the Republican Party, never mind the median voter in the country. Donald Trump was selected as the Republican candidate in 2016 by less than 5% of the US electorate. And so you get much more polarized parties in primaries. Now, it's worth, and this is one picture of polarization. And you can see, since the 1970s, the parties being pulled further apart and getting more extreme. But this is a common story. You can read about it in the newspaper every day. But what people miss in this, and that is, I think, is much more germane to what really matters, is that more partisan doesn't mean more disciplined. People look at the Democrats and the Republicans in Congress and they see them voting in lockstep all the time, and they say, oh, the parties are more disciplined. They're not less disciplined. They're stronger. They're not weaker. But, and here I commend to you a series of paper culminating in this book that's just been published by the University of Chicago Press by Jim Curry and Francis Lee. And they point out that since the 1970s, if you don't look at things like roll call votes, which is what most of this literature is based on, but you look at what is actually enacted in Congress, the vast majority of legislation, including important legislation, requires support across the aisle to get adopted. Otherwise, it doesn't get enacted. And that hasn't changed since the 1970s. So, and here, just to make clear what's at stake here, when the Republicans were in opposition, they voted 71 times to repeal the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. But they were free votes in the sense that nobody was holding them accountable for those votes because they weren't actually trying to pass anything. Once they came into office in 2017, the leadership there was no version of the repeal and replace that the leadership could whip the backbench to support. And so that's essentially the Leon Curry story. If you look at what governments actually enact, which is the green line here, over the opposition of the majority, over the minority party in both chambers, it almost never happens. The big outlier here, this is the 111th Congress, which is Obama's first term. So that is, you're looking at Dodd-Frank and you're looking at the Affordable Care Act. But the standard story is not that. The standard story is the parties cannot discipline themselves to enact legislation unilaterally, even when they control both houses and the White House. And that hasn't changed since the 1970s. So the big story here is not just primaries. It's the interaction between primaries and safe seats. So, and the clue here is we've had primaries in the legislature in the US since the beginning of the 20th century, the progressive era. They weren't important at the presidential level until after the 70s. But what's changed is the increasing number of safe seats that has made it the case that primaries become increasingly important. Because if a seat is a safe seat, then the only election that really matters is the primary. And so you have very low turnout primaries picking the candidates who are actually going to get elected. And here there is a partisan difference. This is safe seats by party in the US House. And what you can see is that the number of Republican safe seats is higher and has increased more than the Democratic safe seats. This shows up in the primary challenges here. I don't know if you can, how well you can see this, but this is stuff we're working on right now, where the challenges are in blue and the incumbents are in yellow. This is for the Republicans. And again, you can see that these are, the CF score is from Adam Bonica's work. It's the ideology of the candidates read off the ideology of the people who give them money, candidate finance. And you can see that the challenges in safe seats are further away from the median voter than the incumbents. Same story on the Democratic side. The challenges are in blue and the incumbents are in orange. And again, you see in the safe seats, the candidates are being pulled towards the extremes. So that's the big story, and it makes it possible for populist candidates to mobilize discontented people in this type of system in a different way than in the multi-party systems, by promising, remedies that won't work, like protectionism and implausible claims they're going to bring back industrial jobs, and anti-immigration policies when all the jobs now are going to technology anyway. But it shows up in a different way. And the big danger in two-party systems is that a weak party can become hijacked by, in the case of the Republicans, first the Tea Party at the legislative level and then Trump at the presidential level. I could talk, if people want, about the way in which the presidential election system is also, the parties have become weaker. And what you really want is, if we really want governments to compete over what they'll do in office, rather than what partisans on the fringes want them to be committed to, then fewer, larger, disciplined parties are better custodians of voter interest in the medium run. And we really need disciplined parties, and that is most likely to occur in two-party systems when the district median voter is similar to the national median voter. So again, going to your part of the world, one of the big problems in the British system is that you've got relatively small constituencies and increasing regional variation. So you get, first of all, you get Scottish nationalism and the continuing Northern Irish parties, but also all the wealth is in London. So the British system would be better if there was a sliver of London in every constituency. What's really desirable is if people running for office have to have urban, suburban, and rural voters in their districts, so that they have to discount what each of those groups wants by what each of the others wants. And that's best. It's also the case that if the district median voter is closer to the national median voter, you're not going to see the kind of fragmentation with Scottish nationalists or the Quebecois that we see in Canada, or the huge regional variation which produces party proliferation in India. And then the other thing that helps discipline parties is if backbenchers and frontbenchers pick one another over time, so that the backbenchers will pick leaders who can help them get reelected, and the frontbenchers will pick backbenchers who can get elected in all the constituencies, but also support a national program. And that is the end of my slides. So why don't I stop there? It's, I think, just over 40 minutes, and everybody can tell me why I'm wrong.
Thanks very much, Ian. We'll now take questions, so please feel free to either type into the Q&A and we'll read it out, or you can raise your hand and we'll allow you to talk.
I'm only seeing 3 people on the participant list.
You're seeing the panelists, so the attendees, currently 14.
Okay, so I won't see the others. Okay, well, you will have to be the conduit, right, then?
Yes.
Okay.
Just give it a little bit of time to get some questions in.
Irina, can people use the hand function? Can people signal whether or not they can use the hand function?
I think you should be able to. I think. If you're not able to raise your hand, you can type in a question into the Q&A or tell me that you're trying to raise your hand.
Well, while we're waiting, hopefully for people to try and figure out how to get the questions going, I think I might start with a question to Ian, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So Ian, I just wanted to get a sense of whether you actually have any solutions to the background problems that are underlying this sort of polarization. So, you mentioned there that you don't want people to adopt systems that mean that people lurch towards, unworkable solutions like protectionism or other sorts of things.
Yeah.
But those background structural issues that you're talking about, they're quite profound.
Yeah.
Is there any system that is really, that you have in mind that can actually address those kind of background issues? I mean, that's a huge question, but I just thought I'd throw it out there while we're
Michael Gratz and I have just published a book called The Wolf at the Door, The Menace of Economic Insecurity and How to Fight It. Harvard Press 2020, which is all about that. It's about what kinds of policies would actually address these underlying issues, the core one being long-term job insecurity. Unless and until parties address that, you're going to have the kind of politics we've been getting for the last decade, because desperate people do desperate things. And it's very easy for populist politicians to mobilize those desperate people who are downwardly mobile, who don't see a good future for themselves or their children, who, in the US case, have horrific health insurance. So the policies that we outline in our book are addressed exactly to those issues, such as very robust lifelong retraining and repositioning programs for what we call, it's a program of universal adjustment assistance. And actually, I've been on some of the Biden campaign's policy writing committees pushing this kind of policy. It's many countries have trade adjustment assistance, which is the Danes probably have the best version of it, but for people who lose their jobs to trade. But the jobs are increasing, they're not going to trade, they're going to technology. So we need a world in which there's going to be perpetual retraining of displaced workers to get them back into the workforce. So that we have a chapter about that. We have a chapter about how this book is principally focused on the US. We have a chapter about health insurance and how to put together a coalition for that within the confines of the American system. But unless and until politicians, and we argue business interests as well, because labor is now so weak, start to realize that it's actually in their interest to get behind and promote these kinds of policies. People keep saying, well, the problem is Trump, but Trump is a symptom. Trump isn't the problem. The reason, it's what's producing Trump. It's what's producing the vote for the AFD. That's what has to be addressed. And tinkering with the electoral system to try under the illusion that giving voters more direct control is going to lead to a world in which their concerns can be addressed is, it's running around inside the dependent variable. It's not focusing on what actually has to be done. So I completely agree with you. And but that's a different, I could have given that talk, it's a different talk. But I was told I needed to talk about parties, so yeah.
Well, thank you, Ian. This has been a great talk. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in. Irene, do you want to read those out?
Yes, so we have one question from an anonymous attendee. Very interesting discussion. Professor Shapiro, do you think Brexit can be attributed to the weakening of both Conservative and Labour parties?
Yes, is the short answer. Let me explain why referendums are very bad for democratic politics. It sounds great. Everybody can vote issue by issue, and it's more direct democracy. What could be so bad about that? But here's the thing to think about. I'll give you an example from the US first, and then I'll come to Brexit. if you ask American voters, would you like a tax cut? Any tax cut? 70% will say yes. Even the estate tax, which is paid, is paid by the top 2%, more than half of it's paid by the top half of 1%. Estates of more than $20 million. You'll get 60-70% people will say yes. But if you say, would you like a tax cut if, would you like, say, that tax cut if it means getting rid of free prescription drug benefits for senior citizens? Then they'll say no. Okay, so what's going on there? In the first case, people are thinking just about the tax cut. In the second case, they're forced to discount their preference for a tax cut by their preference for keeping prescription drug benefits for seniors, and then they come out somewhere else, right? That's what political parties do. Political parties bundle issues and then discount everything they want to press for by everything else they want to press for, and they try to do it in a way that will appeal to the largest number of voters in a two-party system in particular. It works differently in multi-party systems. So just to stick on taxes for one more second, and then I'll come to Brexit. How did the anti-tax movement get going in the US? It got going in California in 1978 with something called Proposition 13, which was a referendum in California limiting property taxes, out of which much of local government and education and policing is paid, to 1% of assessed value. And so it immediately created a huge fiscal crisis in California. And who turned out to vote for that? It was the anti-tax crowd, right? They care intensely about that. And so, and then that was copied in about 20 other states. And that's what gave ballast to the anti-tax movement in the US. So now come to Brexit. Britain had never had a referendum until 1975. And in the 70s, the parties were exactly the opposite of what they've since become on Europe. Labour was split over Europe because they basically, unions had better protections in the UK. And the reason the Tories, including, by the way, Margaret Thatcher, were strongly pro-European, was that they thought it would bring much needed competition and discipline, labor market discipline, as they understood the need of it, to be in Europe. And so Labour was split, and Harold Wilson didn't want to have that fight. And so he said, let's have a referendum. And the referendum caused it to survive. In fact, it didn't prevent the fight in the Labour Party. 5 years later, when Michael Foot got control of the leadership and started pushing for leaving Europe anyway, Owen and Shirley Williams and that crowd all stormed out and created the Social Democrats. So he was ducking that problem in the Labour Party with a referendum. Cameron was trying to do exactly the same thing with the Tories. But the telltale data, I think, and this is in the paper that I circulated, is if you look at the parliament that was elected in 2015, it was overwhelmingly pro-Europe, both parties. And then you get the Brexit result, right? And you could say, okay, well, British voters have just changed their mind. But in fact, if you look at the parliament that was elected in 2017, it was just as pro-European as I think it was something like 19 of 23 people in Theresa May's cabinet had been pro-European in the Brexit vote. They had voted to remain. They had been Remainers. And so what moved these people? it was the entryist threat by, again, the equivalent of, there were the UKIP people on the right fringe of the Conservative Party who were threatening people in their constituencies. We are also looking at safe versus less safe constituencies and entryism in the UK now. But so it's the same kind of story as Tea Party voters. And the reason Theresa May couldn't get she couldn't get a parliamentary majority for her deal or for any alternative to it through Parliament, whether whipped or unwhipped, including the alternative at that point of asking for more time, was because the anti-Brexiteers didn't agree on what they were in favor of. I mean, the pro-Brexiteers didn't agree on what they were in favor of. The right wing of the Tory party, what do they want? They want Singapore on the Thames. What does the left wing of the Labour Party want? They want socialism in one country. So it's a completely artificial choice. It's just like saying to Americans, do you want a tax cut? They'll say yes, right? Do you hate European bureaucrats? Yes, right? But there's nothing. It's a completely artificial choice, and this is the trouble with referendum politics. And the vast majority of people in Parliament know that, given the amount of trade Britain has with Europe, and it's not going to be good for people in their constituencies. But even there, look, Johnson is now facing exactly the same problem that Theresa May faced. There's nothing the Europeans will give him that he's going to be able to get through Parliament. And so, in all probability, they will crash out in December. So I think it's the weakening of the parties, the greater role of constituency systems in selecting candidates, nowhere near as pathological in the US, but they went down that path. In fact, in 2016, the Tories even experimented with what they called primaries in some constituencies, which are actually more like US caucuses. And they quickly changed their minds, maybe as a result of looking at what happened in the US in 2016. But anyway, they didn't do it in the next election. I'm not quite sure why they abandoned that.
All right, we have another question. So Anna Applebaum is about to publish, I think that means book, in which she speaks about two forms of nationalism. One being patriotic and traditionalist, and like respect for old buildings, heritage, and things like that. And the other is, instead of being fond of the past, you try to recreate it. Would you consider that an element of today's nationalism? Represents an attempt to return to this view of a glittering past that removes anomalies, such as immigration, political sharing of aims. Sorry, I think that's.
Well, I haven't read Anne's book, but it reminds me of Ben Anderson's book Imagined Communities from decades ago, where he distinguishes patriotism from nationalism in a similar kind of way. I'm not sure, in service of what Anne is writing this book now. Presumably it's a response to the explosion of xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment in so many countries. So maybe she's saying, we should find a genteel form of this kind of identification rather than get the virulent form. The backward-looking form, I mean, the main problem with the virulent form is it's twofold. One, it's virulent, it breeds, the worst kind of xenophobic politics. But so you know, it's mobilizing people on the basis of ethnicity. But you know, my view is that why do parties do that? I think you should ask the question, why are they doing it, right? And usually the reason parties are doing it is to distract voters from something that they're not doing, right? And so in the US, you know, why is Trump playing all these cards? It's to distract voters from not addressing, you know, the long-term job insecurity. I mean, you know, the backward-looking, he's going to bring the jobs back from China. It's just bullshit. He's not. And anyway, they're not going to China. They're going to machines, you know. It's just a complete distraction. And you get, you know, it's the oldest trick in the book. I mean, read V.O. Key's Southern Politics from decades ago, that the easiest way to put together a coalition is to demonize some group of outsiders. You know, the reason your situation has gone to hell is because, you know, Mexicans are taking your jobs, or affirmative action is taking your jobs, or something like this. So you mobilize people on the basis of some kind of identity politics in order to divert their attention from what would actually serve their interests. This is why I think the people on the left in the US who think, oh, all we need is European PR. I mean, that's why I put those numbers up about Germany. Imagine if we had a multi-party system in the US, how big the Tea Party would be in Congress, and how, you know, it would be our version of the AfD. And, you know, Trump would be at the head of it. Again, and these are people mobilizing disaffected, downwardly mobile workers on the basis of identity politics, just going back to Mark's first question, because then they don't want to address the sources of their insecurity. And so making it, you know, if you have a system where parties can fragment, or the parties are very weak, it just makes it easier for those kind of distractions to become a basis of political mobilization. So you know, for me, this is a long-winded answer, but for me, it's not, should we distinguish good and bad nationalism, but ask the question, why are people mobilizing voters on this basis in the first place? You know, voters, I think and this is why I started with the economic stuff. So much of the literature in political science, and it's even worse in political philosophy, seems to think that voters' preferences fall out of the sky. You know, it's just that, well, people have become more polarized. Well, why have they become more polarized? It's not like, you know, 62 million Americans were sitting there saying, oh, if only someone would come along and say, build a wall, and Mexico will pay. You know, they weren't. But, you know, he saw that those desperate people could be mobilized by demonizing that outgroup, and then he was off to the races. So I you know, I don't want to comment on Ann's book, not having read it, but that's sort of how I think about nationalism and anti-immigrant sentiment and identity politics.
All right, we have another question. I'm curious about the effect of multi-party versus two-party systems on political party participation. Is there a structure or system or another variable that results in higher participation of individuals at the party level, especially for median income voters?
Well, what comes after the especially is a separate question. You know, what we mostly have seen is in the US is participation from people on the fringes. So it's not increased because of primary. primary, another way of thinking, sort of not to be too Coasian about it, but another way of thinking about the increased role of primaries, it's the American equivalent of party fragmentation, right? It's fragmentation within a two-party system. You essentially, these parties are fragmenting because the primary voters are as I said, if we had a multi-party system, the Tea Party would be our equivalent of the Alternative for Deutschland, or the ultra-nationalist party. Is there more participation in multi-party systems? There used to be, and indeed, when I started working on this and giving talks on it, and especially in Europe, people said, well, there's more voter alienation in two-party systems, and that's a reason to have multi-party systems. The question is, what comes of addressing the alienation, to my mind. So go back to the 1930s. It's good to have some historical distance. Was it better to have higher levels of participation in Weimar Germany than in Britain and the US in the 1930s? Not obvious, right? It's not obvious. Another way of putting it is, participation isn't an end in itself. So there's a long political science literature on participation going back to Almond and Verber, the civic culture. And, they questioned this in the 1940s. They said, well, maybe low levels of participation reflect the fact that most people are reasonably contented with what the political system is delivering. Why is it so terrible? It's kind of early version of Downsian ignorance. Why is it so terrible? If the political system and the political economy are delivering for people, so they don't feel the need to be mobilized and to vote. But if it's not delivering, then they'll be mobilized to vote. But what are they going to be mobilized to vote for? So it's now the second part of the question. Well, is it median income people who would be mobilized more? I think yes, because even median income people are increasingly facing wage stagnation and downward mobility. It's not just about the bottom, right? This is why, in some respects, I think Piketty's done a disservice by focusing so much attention on the top 1%, because it's really what's going on in the bottom 3 quintiles. That's where the desperation is. It's where the downward mobility is. And, punitive taxation on the top 1% is, as a policy in and of itself, is not going to have much effect on that unless that money is spent in ways that I was talking about earlier. So more participation is not obviously, a naturally given good. Depends who's participating and why.
Alrighty, we have another question. Do you think liberal democracy based on constructing broad coalitions and a welfare state, as in the post-war tradition, has become untenable due to voters' bounded rationality and informational echo bubbles from social media?
I think it's not. I think untenable is a strong word, but I think it's become much harder. But again, I don't think the information stuff is the core of the problem. I think it's the weak parties that's the core of the problem. So I didn't want to talk about too many different papers we're writing at once, but here's one we're looking at. It used to be said the conservatives are the deficit hawks, and the liberals always want to spend. Right, and so the right wants to shrink government, and the left wants to spend money, and that's the sort of tussle in social democracy that you get, the left comes in, it's the Attlee government or whatever, and then you get some reaction, and it's a sort of ebb and flow of social democratic politics. Look at the US over the last 40 years and look at why is there such a fiscal crisis of the American welfare state? A big part of the answer is the following. On the one hand, we've had the anti-tax movement, which I described to you already, right? And no Republican can vote to raise taxes. You'll just get massacred in the primaries. You can't support tax increases in the Republican Party. But if you look at what we call pro-cyclical deficit spending, so deficit spending that's not about managing the business cycle, pro-cyclical deficit spending, right? So running up deficits that have nothing to do with ending recessions. It's huge, starting in the Reagan administration with Star Wars, and then you get the two wars we fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, all 100% financed on deficit, huge giveaways to Halliburton and these big producer groups. Or look at Medicare Part D, huge giveaway by Republicans to the pharmaceutical industry. Trump's tax cut in 2017. This, again, none of this is counter-cyclical. It has nothing to do with recessions. Huge giveaways to very rich taxpayers, right? So here you have a world in which the party is so weak that it can neither resist the tax cutting lobby nor its spending lobby, right? And so they just run up structural deficits. Now in European systems, it's more complicated because if you don't have a reserve currency, you can't run long-term structural deficits. But in countries like Japan, where there's other ways to run deficits, you can. And, even in European countries, again, you see nobody can implement the kind of marginal tax rates that existed in the 1970s. Look, Hollande tried to do it in France. He tried to put in a 70% marginal tax rate. He had his head handed to him, even though almost nobody would have paid it. There you don't see pro-cyclical deficit spending because they can't run deficits in the EU and all that. And they don't have reserve currencies. But you're seeing a transfer of spending from less powerful groups like now labor, because it's so much, to more powerful groups. And so that we're looking at that now as an example of, of what it is that's making it so hard to run these traditional welfare states. But I don't think it's the information stuff. It's the weak parties, which makes them completely controllable. It's the weak parties in the American system, the fragmentation in the European system, which makes it harder and harder and harder for them to put together the coalitions to do what was done in the heyday of social democracy or New Deal welfare states here.
Thanks very much. We still have about 9 minutes left. No more questions on the list, but I guess I have one myself.
Sure.
I was wondering basically if there's a way to strengthen the Republican Party in the US after Trump, because it seems like what happened was once you kind of open that door to a populist, he moves the median Republican voter further to the right. And even if after this, more establishment, if they suffer an electoral defeat and more establishment Republicans come back and say, no, we have to kind of go back to what we were before, it seems hard to believe that they would ever resemble the Republican Party of the 90s or the 80s, because the median voter has shifted further to the right. So it seems like they're going to have to stay in that area and not ever be able to kind of rebuild the party to something that, what you would consider to be a strong party.
So it's actually a great question to end on. And this is a book Francis and I are now writing called The Future of Populism. And so It's one reason why we think it would be a huge mistake. There's so many people running around now talking about moving to some form of PR in the US. Think about how it ended in the 30s. In the 30s, not only did Britain and the US not wind up with a Mussolini or a Hitler in power, but the US in the 30s enacted the New Deal, right? I mean, there were proto-fascists here. There was Lindbergh. There were all these people, but the U.S. pulled away from that and enacted the New Deal. And whereas in Europe, we know how it ended in the 30s. It wasn't cool, right? In these multi-party systems. And so, if you think about what's going on in the Republican Party now, if they continue being pulled to the right, as they are, eventually the party is going to be so far from the median voter that they will just lose. Either the Republican Party will have to have an internal, they'll be out of power for long enough, just as Labor, when Labor was, from 1979 to 1997 was out of power. Eventually, they had to restructure themselves to get some back into power. So either the Republicans will have to do the mirror image of some version of that, or it'll be like the 1850s and the Whigs. So they'll just disintegrate, and they'll be replaced by another right of center party. But if we continue to have single member district system with very large constituencies, which is what we have, we're going to have a two-party system. It's the ABC of Duverger's law. And this is why absolutely the wrong conclusion to draw is these systems need to become multi-party systems. On the contrary, it's much more look at the Tories. They're already, as I said, they got over their flirtation with what they called primaries. They're getting rid of the Fixed Parliaments Act, which is terrible for party discipline. Theresa May would have been able to discipline the Tories to support her deal if she had been able to threaten them with an election, in all probability. So they're getting rid of the Fixed Parliaments Act. So they are, they stumbled into some of these party weakening reforms, and now they're stumbling out of them. You're fortunate you don't have a written constitution, because some of the worst features of our system, you'd have to change the constitution. But my prediction is, if Trump loses, they will greatly reform the primary system at the presidential level to make it much harder for that to happen in the future. And if they don't, they'll be in the wilderness for a long time, or completely disintegrate. So, whereas it's not, you look at a country like Germany today, it's far from clear where this is headed, right? More and more fragmentation is where it's headed. And as I said, the grass always looks greener somewhere else, but the British system, the Westminster system, was never designed by anybody. It emerged as a result of slow evolution and blind staggering luck. But be careful before you throw it out.
We actually had one question come in at the very end, so there's still about 4 minutes. I'll just read it out. How can illiberal parties with relatively good governance track records, such as the Law and Justice Party in Poland, be combated? Does your theory imply that you can maintain an illiberal social agenda if you deliver constant economic growth?
It's the only way you can. I mean, it's, just go one step further, go to China. I mean, in authoritarian systems or very authoritarian democratic systems, people will accept it so long as it's really delivering big time for them. But, it's no, in my view, it's no accident that as growth has slowed in China, the states had to become more repressive, because it's the implicit social contract, right? You make us rich, and we will let you go in the way however you want. But so long as they can keep delivering, you know, they'll be able to avoid that, avoid the comeuppance. But, you know, I think there are other reasons for thinking that authoritarian run capitalisms, you know, it's one thing when you're doing basic development and infrastructure. It's quite another trying to run a complex economy where you have all the terrible information problems that are generated by single party dominant systems and the huge corruption you get if there's no real political competition. So I don't think it's as an economist would say, I don't think efficient authoritarianism is a medium-term equilibrium.
Great. Thanks so much, Ian.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. I think you've had a very good run there of questions, and thank you for a really stimulating talk. An hour and a half is quite a long time to be in the focus, especially with in this age of computer screens.
Well, you guys are up much later than I am.
Well, yeah, I think some people are ready to go for their.
I didn't keep you from the pub. Are you allowed to go to the pub?
No, sadly not.
Oh, okay.
Unless it's with people that are in your bubble, your support bubble. I think if I've got the rules right.
Oh, well, okay. They would have already left by now if they'd been able to. All right.
Anyway, I'd like to say thank you to you for speaking to us this evening. Just before everybody goes, I'd just like to briefly announce the schedule of events that we have at the centre. So on November 10th, we've got Jeffrey Friedman, who's going to be speaking on populism and technocracy. On November 17th, we've got James C. Scott, who's going to be talking on a golden age of barbarians. Interesting title there. November 23rd, Melanie Cammett, The Politics of Service Delivery. December 3rd, Christina Bicchieri, Norm Nudging and Social Influences. And then on December 8th, Barrett Richman on Stateless Commerce. So thanks to everybody for joining, and to Ian again for the great talk and the discussion. And I hope you'll join us again in the near future for some of these events. So thank you very much, and thanks, Irina, for taking the questions.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Cheers.
Bye.